Greetings. In this video, I wanted to look at Psalm 22:1 in Eʋegbe and in various Semitic languages. I intend this video as part of the ongoing discussion on the proximity of the Ewe language, or Eʋegbe, to Biblical Hebrew. So we're going to look at the first part of that verse, which is the opening verse of the 22nd Psalm. And by that I mean the part which basically translates to, my God, why have you abandoned me? Or perhaps the most well-known translation, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we're going to look at a translation of that statement into the Ewe language, courtesy of the Bible Society of Ghana's 2006 Éwé Revised version, which I'll link to in the video description. And we'll compare that Eʋegbe translation, or that Ewe translation, to the biblical Hebrew text for that verse, as well as to translations into different Semitic languages, such as Arabic, Ge'ez, and a few different dialects of Aramaic. So at the bottom of your screen is the Ewe translation of the relevant verse. And now I will place the biblical Hebrew text at the top of the screen, which reads, Eli, Eli, lama azabtani. After that, I'll add the standard Jewish Aramaic translation, which is found in Targum Yonatan, which reads, Eli, Eli, metulma shabaktani. And now I want to add the transliteration which appears in the Greek text of Matthew 27:46. Now, this transliteration can be understood as capturing the pronunciation of a Hebrew sentence which employs an Aramaic verb, or alternatively an Aramaic sentence which is very close to Hebrew. However, because it uses the Aramaic verb shabak rather than the Hebrew verb that you see at the top of your screen, azab, and or la'azob if you want it in the infinitive, because it employs that Aramaic root, that Aramaic verb, and because the earliest readings employ an epsilon in that third word, lema, I'm going to treat this as Aramaic and render it as Eli, Eli, lema shabaktani. Note how, significant to this being Aramaic rather than Hebrew, note how that third word is spelled lamed mem aleph. That's the Aramaic version of this combination of preposition and interrogative particle, which will be discussed later in the video. If we treated it as Hebrew, we would have spelled it lamed mem he, like the text at the top of your screen, lama. But instead I have the Aramaic lama, right? Lamed mem aleph. On an interesting side note, the old Syriac reading for Matthew 27:46 not in the Peshitta, but in the Mount Sinai Codex, also reads this way, and at least in terms of the consonantal structure, save for it having lemana rather than lema, which is to say that it has a nun before the aleph in that third word, right? But that aside, next we're going to have the Syriac translation as found in the Peshitta of the Psalms, right? Allahi, Allahi, lemana shabaktani. Right, and this precise reading can also be found in the Peshitta to Mark 15:34, though not in the Peshitta to Matthew, which is interesting. And then we have the standard Arabic translation, Ilahi, Ilahi, limada taraktani. And as I noted earlier, I also want to include the Ge'ez translation as found in the Ge'ez translation of the Psalms, which is somewhat different. It reads, Amlaki, Amlaki, Natsureni, Walament khadagani, right? And this portion right here, Natsureni, and then the conjunction before lament, that's I would describe that as extra, right? At least it's extra material from the perspective of the biblical Hebrew text, insofar that it doesn't correspond to anything that we find in the Hebrew text. Now, perhaps the Ge'ez Psalms were translated from a text which had this extra material. Natsureni is the imperative with the pronominal suffix, and it means like something like look upon me. But for this discussion, I'm going to set that portion to gray, and I'm going to skip over it. And, for what it's worth, the corresponding lines that appear in Ge'ez translations of the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 27:46, and the Gospel of Mark, Mark 15:34, the line lacks that portion which I just set to gray. So as I just alluded to in this video, when we're comparing the different parts of these different statements, I'm going to ignore the Ge'ez text, which is in gray. In other words, I'm just going to skip over it, reading directly from, amlaki to lament, right? So for now, ignoring the portion which reads Natsureni, and then with that conjunction, the wa, I'm just going to read it as amlaki, lament khadagani, right? As the portion marked in gray does not have, it does not correspond to anything which is going to appear in the other statements. So with all that before us, now we have the 7 statements on the screen. One is in Eʋegbe, and the other 6 are in Semitic languages, 3 being from different dialects of Aramaic, and 1 each from Hebrew, Arabic, and Ge'ez, respectively. And with that, we can begin to look at the structures of these sentences and discuss the corresponding portions. And what I think will become clear in this comparison is that the statements in the Semitic languages are very similar to one another. Even though they use different vocabulary, their structures are the same, the grammars are the same. Meanwhile, the Eʋegbe statement is much more different and is an outlier, essentially. And I think this will serve as an example of how even when we put vocabulary aside, Eʋegbe is not only not Hebrew, but it is outside of the spectrum of the Semitic languages. All the other Semitic languages are far closer grammatically and structurally to Hebrew than Eʋegbe is. So let's begin this comparison, and let's start with the word for God. And I have this color-coded, I've color-coded the relevant portions, which I'm going to do throughout this discussion. I'm going to color-code different portions of each statement we discuss. So in each sentence, I've marked the word for God in blue and the possessive determiner in red, right? So it's not just God, it's my God, right? So the word for God is marked in blue, and the my part, the possessive part, is marked in red. Now notice how in all of the Semitic languages, the possessive determiner takes on the form of a suffix, a possessive suffix at the end of the noun, right? So in Hebrew and in the 2 forms of Jewish Aramaic, so basically the top 3 lines, the word for God is El, and then the first person singular possessive suffix added to the end, right? My God is Eli, right? In Syriac, the word for God is Allah, and with the possessive suffix, it's Allahi, right? If other dialects of Syriac, it might be Alo and Alohi. In Arabic, the word for God is Ilah, and with the possessive suffix, it's Ilahi. In the Ge'ez, the word for God is Amlak, and with the possessive suffix, my God is Amlaki, right? So you notice every single time in all the Semitic languages, the word for God appears, and then it's after that comes this suffix, the possessive suffix for my God, right? Now notice how the Eʋegbe translation does not follow that pattern. Rather than using a possessive suffix, the possessive adjective appears before the noun. So right away, right at the start, we already have one example of how Eʋegbe differs from all Semitic languages, including Hebrew. With that, let's now move on to the portion which asks why, right? Before the verb, like, why did you abandon me? Why? Marked in blue, all of the Semitic languages employ an interrogative which begins with mem. The Hebrew employs ma, and so too the Aramaic of the Targum and the Aramaic attributed to Jesus by the Gospel of Matthew, right? Which is that reconstructed sentence. The Syrian Aramaic employs man with the terminal aleph, so mana. The Arabic employs the compound madha, with the first part being that same interrogative particle, ma, and then the second part, the, literally meaning this, right? So madha is like saying, what, this? And we'll come back to that in a moment. And the Ge'ez employs ment, which is etymologically related to the other terms and is most closely related to the Syriac, right? So if we just read through the 6 Semitic statements, we have variations of the same interrogative particle, beginning with mem, right? So from the top, it's ma, man, or mana, ma, and ment, or madha, before ment, and madha in the Arabic, but it's ma, dha. Of the 6 statements in the Semitic languages, 5 precede that interrogative particle with a prefix lam or lamed, which I'm going to call an L preposition or an L prefix, which is marked in red. So in Hebrew, it is lama, and in Aramaic, the Aramaic attributed to Christ, it's lama, and in the Syriac, it's lamana, and in the Arabic, it's limada, and in the Ge'ez, it's lament, right? In all these cases, the combination of that L preposition or that L prefix, that lamed prefix, and the interrogative particle literally means for what, right? But more properly together, they mean, it's like asking why. So for what? Like for what reason? Why? The one statement from a Semitic language which does not follow that exact pattern, employing the L prefix or the lamed prefix, is the Aramaic from Targum Yonatan, which is that second line from the top, which does not employ that prefix lamed. Rather, it employs the word metul, and metul means like account or cause or reason. So that phrase metul ma means what account, what reason, what cause, right? So it's like saying for what reason. In short, it too means why. Now, compare that with the Eʋegbe statement, which is again completely different. There is no variation of that mem interrogative particle like with all the Semitic languages, and there's no lamed prefix or L prefix, L suffix like with most of the Semitic statements. And now we move to the verb. Now, in each case, I've marked the verb in red, and then in blue, I've marked the element which signifies that the verb is being rendered in the second person masculine singular perfect tense. You might notice that there's no blue portion for the Ge'ez statement at the bottom, which I'll get to in a moment. But for the 5 other Semitic language statements, the second person singular perfect tense is conveyed by a ta or a ta suffix appended to the end of the triliteral verb root. So with the Hebrew, the red portion by itself, azab, would mean he abandoned, but with that tau marked in blue, it's azabta, you abandoned. In the 3 forms of Aramaic, shabak, marked in red, would mean he abandoned, but with that tau marked in blue, it's shabakta, you abandoned. So too in Arabic, taraka means marked in red by itself would mean he abandoned, but with the ta, tarakta means you abandoned. Now we get to the Ge'ez statement at the bottom of the screen, which, as I said, is a bit different. Hypothetically speaking, if Ge'ez followed the same pattern as the other Semitic languages, the verb would have been, again, this is just hypothetically, and in theory, the verb would have been chadagta, right? Or with the pronominal suffix, in theory, hypothetically speaking, with that pronominal suffix serving as the object of the verb, it would have been chadagtani, right? So it would have been azabtani, shabaktani, taraktani, and then the Ge'ez, in theory, if it followed the same pattern, would be chadagtani, right? But that is not what appears. Rather than that hypothetical construction, chadagtani, we have chadagani. To explain what is going on here, permit me to show the basic structure of verbs in the second person masculine singular perfect tense for these different languages, these different Semitic languages. At the base, you're going to have the triliteral root, the 3 letters of the verbal root, here designated by R1, R2, R3 for each of the radical letters of the root. Then, note that in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic, the second person masculine singular perfect tense is rendered when the verb takes on a ta suffix, right? Ge'ez, however, is different, as instead verbs in this tense take on a ka suffix, like a k, right? So following this basic structure with the verb for abandoned, if Ge'ez followed the same pattern as the other languages, one would find chadagta, right? But rather than chadagta, what you would get in theory is chadagka, right? And then with the pronominal suffix signifying the object of the verb, right, that the verb was performed on me, in theory, you would get chadagkani, right? However, there is yet still another difference with Ge'ez, and that is that when that ka suffix is preceded by the equivalent of a gimel or a kaf, which is to say the equivalent of a g or a q in that third radical of the root, that root letter assimilates the ka suffix. And you can see this discussed briefly in August Dillmann and Carl Bezold's Ethiopic grammar. And you can pause your screen here to look at the relevant portion, but I'll also give the full reference to the source in the video description for anyone who might want to check out a hard copy at their leisure. So anyway, the point here is that what in theory would have been Khadagani instead takes on the form Khadagani. Again, because that K suffix gets assimilated into the G in the third letter of the root. And that's why the Ge'ez translation here reads the way it does, Khadagani, not Khadagtani, as if it was following the exact same pattern as the other languages, and not Khadagkani if it was, if it didn't, if there wasn't this case where the third root letter assimilates the suffix. Now let's look at the Eʋegbe verb. What signifies that it's in the second person is a prefix, not a suffix. Now, admittedly, in Semitic languages, the precise person of a conjugation can likewise be signified by a prefix when it's in the imperfect tense, which is to say the non-past, but not in the perfect tense, which is what we're using here. And here, perfect tense would correspond, like I said, to our notion of past tense. Moreover, to show how different Eʋegbe is from other Semitic languages, the structure of the verbs in Eʋegbe do not change between perfect tense and imperfect tense, or between past and non-past, if you will, right? The structure remains the same, and whether it's past or not past has to be inferred from the surrounding context. So that is very different grammatically from Semitic languages. And finally, we come to the element which signifies the object of the verb, and signifies that this object is in the first person singular, right? That this verb is being performed on me. So in all Semitic languages, the first person singular pronominal suffix is ni with a nun, like the N in name or nation or Nancy, right? And it's vocalized ni, right? So going from top to bottom, it is azabdani in Hebrew, shabaktani in all three forms of Aramaic, taraktani in Arabic, and khadagani in Ge'ez, right? In all these cases, it means you abandoned me, right? The fact that the object is me is conveyed by that pronominal suffix ni. And once again, the Eʋegbe translation, the Ewe translation here is different. It does manage to use a suffix, but the object suffix is different. It's M. And if you compare the Eʋegbe object suffixes or pronominal suffixes to the pronominal suffixes of Semitic languages, you'd see how different they are. Eʋegbe is very different from any of the Semitic languages. And I'll share a link to a grammar of Eʋegbe in the video description. But on a side note, one might notice the DI at the end of the Eʋegbe sentence, the D, that relates to the verb, and it's going to remain the same irrespective of the person of the object, right? So if it's third person, first person, second person, that's going to remain the same. So with that, let's quickly summarize the differences which were covered in this discussion. First, for the phrase my God, all the Semitic languages put a possessive suffix at the end of the noun, making a single word, while Eʋegbe puts a possessive adjective before the noun, creating a phrase of two words. Second, when asking why, all the Semitic languages employed variations of an interrogative particle beginning with mem. So ma, man, ment. And almost all the Semitic language statements had an L preposition, a lamed preposition, prefixed to that particle. So you had lama, lama, lemana, lemadha, lament. The Eʋegbe construction was nothing like that. Third, in all the Semitic languages, verbs in the second person singular perfect or past tense have the verb root typically followed by a suffix. In this case, the Ge'ez root assimilated that suffix, but nonetheless, typically a past tense construction or a perfect tense construction has the verb root followed by a suffix which conveys that it's in the what person it's in, unless it's the third person singular, right? So the second person singular perfect or past tense singular would have that suffix, right, typically. Meanwhile, the Eʋegbe does not even have distinct forms for past and non-past verb constructions, and Eʋegbe conveys the second person through a prefix rather than a suffix. And finally, fourth, the suffix conveying the relevant object pronoun or pronomial suffix is the same across the Semitic languages. Remember, it's ni. Meanwhile, it's different in Eʋegbe. And moreover, Eʋegbe object pronouns are consistently different from the object pronouns or pronomial suffixes found in Semitic languages. And that's it. I think this short discussion illustrates how different the grammar and structure of Eʋegbe is, not only from Hebrew, but so too from the rest of the Semitic languages. Aramaic, Arabic, and Ge'ez are far closer to Hebrew than is Eʋegbe, which hence why it's understandable that Eʋegbe is categorized as outside the family of Semitic languages, right? And, so I'm going to close this video. As always, I look forward to the comments and questions of others. I suppose through the comments and through the reactions that this video might receive, we'll see if there's a need for more discussion or if this might just close the book on the claim that Eʋegbe is ancient Hebrew or the closest language to ancient Hebrew, right? If need be, I can go deeper into the differences between the grammar of Eʋegbe and the grammar of Hebrew or the grammars of other Semitic languages. But for now, on that note, I'll simply say, God bless.
I mean, what else you expect from this caliber of people?
I mean, yeah, these are the ones who Abu debunked about Éwé being the original Hebrew.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. These niggas are going around talking about Éwé is the original Hebrew with no proof, no evidence. They're just saying shit.
The original Hebrew can be found in West Africa, family.